All right. I'm here with Robert Fraser. Good to see you. Am I saying your last name correctly? I realized that I might have been conflating that with the subject of our last conversation, which was
It's okay. You're pronouncing it correctly. It's spelt with an S.
okay.
It's pronounced Fraser, though it can be spelt with a Z. And the person we were talking about last time round was Sir James Fraser, and he's definitely spelt with a Z. I found out the other day that so was my grandfather. So we appear to have changed.
Really?
Yeah.
Did it ever strike you as strange, or I guess just coincidental, that you became so interested in someone with the same last name as you?
I think it was a coincidence.
Yeah.
Sometimes I try and pretend I'm his grandson.
Yeah.
He didn't have any children. That's rather difficult to get away with.
Yeah. So funny. So that seems almost like a perfect segue for our conversation, which is you want to talk a little bit about the difference between biography and fiction,
Yes.
which of course you wrote something of a biography, and I don't know how exactly you would put it, but I remember in our conversation last time you said it was more of a biography of his ideas than a biography of his life. Is that correct?
Yeah. When we talked about Sir James Fraser, yes. I did
Yes.
the same for Marcel Proust.
Okay.
Two sort of intellectual biographies.
And
One is
then there was something closer to family um a family piece or something that the family asked for, but then I think they might have asked for the book, but they didn't necessarily ask for everything that you wrote, right?
yeah, okay, right, yes. I wrote a memoir about my first wife's death. That is memoir.
Mm.
And I also recently published last year a novel which integrates elements of family history in it, but very much transformed. So that's why I'm interested in the transition between the two forms, the two genres.
Awesome. So James Fraser, Proust, a memoir, you said.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, when I was doing a little digging for our first conversation, that memoir has a rather striking title, if I remember
It's called
correctly.
Pascal's Tears.
Pascal's Tears.
Yeah. The
And
novel is called The Quality of the Light.
does does Pascal's Tears, is that the one with the very jarring subtitle?
Yes. It's How Not to Murder Your Wife.
Right. I have to
That
have
sounds
to
a bit alarmist.
Yeah, I'd have to ask about that one.
Well, maybe not today, but
Okay. I'll look into it and then I can follow up.
yeah.
Okay. And the quality of the light. Okay. So what have you been working on recently?
Well, I'm writing a sort of theoretical come historical book called Biography and Fiction Writing across Genres. So I'm interested in the relationship between these two kinds of writing and the way they occasionally merge and then they separate out again. And I think you can really trace this across history. In certain historical periods, they become very close, at times almost indistinguishable, and then they part company again, and then they merge again. And I think we're in a period of literary history where they're getting almost indecently and dangerously close to one another. And maybe one needs to separate them out again. But I'm interested in tracing this across from the 18th century until now, the successive phases of their merging and their separation.
That's fascinating. That sounds like a lot of reading.
I'm afraid it is, yes. But I draw on my reading of the last 50 years. So I've done a certain amount of, a certain crash course in both, but I can draw on my deeper memories of both.
When did you first notice that interesting phenomenon that biography and fiction can start to blend or get very close? That would be an interesting phenomenon in and of itself to observe, but then that happens rhythmically throughout history.
Yeah.
When did you start to notice those things?
Well, I suppose when I was a student and I was studying the 18th century novel, and it struck me that so many 18th century novels read like biographies. In fact, they're not called novels, which is the interesting thing. The term novel did exist. It's existed since 1643. But for some reason in the 18th century, a lot of writers, particularly Daniel Defoe, tended to write books which were actually novels, but labeled as if they were biographies. To just give you a few examples here, have you ever read Moll Flanders by
No,
Daniel Defoe?
no.
Well, it's definitely a novel, but have a look at the title on the title page. It says, "The Fortunes and Misfortunes of Moll Flanders, who was born in Newgate, and during a life of continued variety for 80 years, beside her childhood, with 12 years a whore, 5 times a wife, whereof once to her own brother, 12 years a thief, 8 years a transported felon in Virginia, at last grew rich, lived honest, and died a penitent, written from her own memorandum." What Daniel Defoe does, he pretends that he's the editor of a manuscript which he's found or which has been lent to him, and he's publishing it, but it's not by himself and it's not about himself. So it's about a fictional figure, but he pretends that it's about a real figure. Here's another example, Colonel Jack, by the same writer. This is published about the same time. "The history and remarkable life of the true Honorable Colonel Jack, commonly called Colonel Jack, who was born a gentleman, put prentice to a pickpocket, was 26 years a thief, and then kidnapped the Virginia, came back a merchant, was 5 times married to 4 whores, went into the wars, behaved bravely, got preferment, was made a colonel of a regiment, came over and fled with the chevalier, is still abroad, completing a life of wonders, and resolves to die a general." Now, this person doesn't exist, but Defoe is pretending that he does exist. So in other words, it's a novel pretending to be life writing.
Yeah, what's interesting to me though is even if that person did exist,
Yeah.
you would imagine the conflict as a writer to say he's resolved to do X or he's going to do Y, or even the fact that he went to one place at one time and for 10 years he only did one thing, right?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
you omit there seems extraordinarily important, right?
Yeah.
Having not read too many biographies and certainly not having studied it, it would be really interesting to think about some contemporary biographies and
Yeah.
how granular they attempt to get in
Yeah.
comparison to how sweeping some of those sentences were, albeit, albeit them novels.
Yeah. Well, it depends whether you're looking at it from the point of view of the writer or the point of view of the reader. Now, from the point of view of the writer, Defoe quite clearly knows that these people didn't exist and he's pretending that they are. From the point of the reader, this can be a bit confusing. In fact, Dr. Johnson, of whom you've heard, tells a wonderful anecdote in The Idler, which was a newspaper that he used to publish every week, about an elderly gentleman who was reading Robinson Crusoe. You know, you've read Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is a novel about a sailor who becomes a castaway. But this elderly gentleman takes it as being fact. When he retires from his employment, he devotes all of his life to studying Robinson Crusoe, whom he regards as being an admirable person who he wishes to emulate. But unfortunately, somebody takes him aside one time and says, actually, Robinson Crusoe did not exist. This is a novel. And the poor man is completely disconsolate. He said, "You've deprived me of the one solace of my old age."
And was that a real story, or was that fiction?
An anecdote. Well, I think that's probably something that's true. But I mean, the story is not true. But it's very easy for a reader to come away with the impression that it is.
Sure.
So one wonders what's going on here. the people who were publishing these books in the 18th century were known as booksellers, and professional publishers, as publishing houses as such, did not as yet exist. It seems to have been in the interests of the bookseller to pretend that these were real life histories, so as to draw in a certain proportion of the readership. Now, remember that the 18th century saw in the early modern period the evolution of the novel and the biography side by side, and also journalism. It's one of the first big ages of journalism. And there's a great interest in journalism, scandal, fact, news of the world, what's happening, gossip, okay? And because there's an appetite for gossip, I think the booksellers are really playing up to that. So they're dressing up their fictions as if they're fact.
Interesting. Do you get a sense that there's a moment in history where that begins to flip and people start to dress up their facts as if they're fictions?
I think that happens later on. But in the meantime, what happened in the 19th century, the following century, these genres drift apart from one another. I mean, the novel becomes increasingly florid, verbose, waistcoated, expansive, fanciful, often issued in weekly parts, like Dickens's novels. In the meantime, biography becomes increasingly moralistic, ponderous, concerned with elevating moral examples, and often drawing on letters carefully edited. And I think because the 19th century was a very idealistic period in which people were looking for heroes to emulate and to admire, biography drifted in that direction. So biography drifted towards model lives, the heroic, you see, whereas the novel was often sometimes floundering in the gutter. And he compared Oliver Twist or Nicholas Nickleby with some of the biographies of the period. Just to give you a flavor of 19th century biography, I mean, this is very different from anything in the 18th century. A lot of 19th century, particularly late Victorian biographies, concentrating on figures that people who were admirable, who'd led great lives. People wanted to look up. They wanted somebody to admire. Here's a biography published in 1889 of somebody whom an awful lot of people admired, including my grandfather. This is my grandfather's copy of Macaulay's Life and Letters. Lord Macaulay was a great liberal statesman and an historian. He worked for quite a few years in India, sorting out the education system there. His biography was written by his nephew, George Otto Trevelyan, and it draws extensively on his letters. And quite clearly, the nephew hero worshipped the uncle. And the whole biography really is an act of homage, as so many Victorian biographies were. I'll just give you a flavor of just the beginning of the life and letters of Lord Macaulay. This is the nephew writing about his uncle. He who undertakes to publish the memoirs of a distinguished man may find a ready apology in the custom of the age. If we measure the effective demand for biography by the supply, the person commemorated need possess but a very moderate reputation and have played no exceptional part in order to carry the reader through many 100 pages of anecdote, dissertation, and correspondence. To judge from the advertisements of our circulating libraries, the public curiosity is keen with regard to some who did nothing of special note, and others who acted so continuously in the face of the world that, when their course was run, there was little left of the world to learn about them. It may therefore be taken for granted that a desire exists to hear something authentic about the life of a man who has produced works which are universally known, but which bear little or no indication of the private history and the personal qualities of the author. This was in a marked degree the case with Lord Macaulay. So he's writing about a public man, but he's writing about him from a posture of admiration, as an act of homage, almost kneeling to his memory. So increasingly in the Victorian period, you get really biographies as acts of homage. And that's very difficult to reconcile with a novel. If the novel is concerned with real life and with moral compromise and the difficulties of daily existence, it's difficult to reconcile that with a genre which is continually looking up in an admiring posture to people who are supposed to be perfect. So I think you've got biographies concentrating on heroes and great men, public men, and you've got novels concerned with often lesser stations of life, with real people, not with heroes. And because it seems to me that under that influence, the two forms really drift apart.
That strikes me as interesting because, again, I can't overstate rather how much of a novice I am in thinking these things, but that seems interesting because nowadays it's sort of the opposite, where you have, here's this book about Obama, and I'm going to show you how ordinary he is, and we're going to talk about like his, breakfast routine and these things, and isn't that so appealing, how ordinary his relationship with his children is, and also so extraordinary because he's the president. That seems so interesting to imagine that at some point those interests come back together. Here you have this, I would imagine someone writing a biography like that's interested in sort of holding that person up as a hero, but then also showing how parts of their life are very ordinary and perhaps relatable.
Nowadays, I think we like our biographical subjects to have feet of clay.
What do you mean by that?
Beneath their garments. We want to find out what's wrong with them, and we want to find out what they've got in common with ourselves. So a lot of modern biography is concerned that, well, sometimes with acts of denigration, sometimes with pulling people off their pillars, but at least with leveling everybody out, so everybody seemed to participate in a common human nature. I think in the Victorian period, people were used to looking up. It's a great age of statuary. If you go around London now, you see generals, admirals, great politicians of the past raised on plinths above the crowd. And most of those were put up actually in the Victorian period. A lot of them are to great generals. Great. And a lot of them actually are not only positioned in very heroic postures, but they're actually often wearing neoclassical clothing. They're given togas, they're given Greek or Roman clothing to make them seem removed from everyday life and heroic. That was the Victorian way.
Interesting. What has been your experience in reading biographies from that era, that they sort of buff out any signs of humanity or any errors or things like that?
Absolutely, because nearly all of these biographies were written either by the widow, if it was a man, or rarely the widower, if it was a woman, or, as in the case of Lord Macaulay, by a nephew, certainly a member of the family. And so really, relatives cornered the market for Victorian biography. because they were not only the biographer, they were often the literary executor. So they inherited all of the papers, including all of the letters and the diaries. They drew on them, but in a very edited form, and they cut out anything that might be compromising at all. I'm very interested in a man called Charles Kingsley, who was a Victorian vicar, priest, novelist, social reformer. His biography after his death was written by his widow, typically, Fanny Kingsley, who wrote a book called, The Life and Letters of Charles Kingsley. And she quotes extensively from the letters that he wrote her during their courtship. Now, if you now go and compare those letters with the originals, which are kept in the British Library, they're so edited as to be almost indistinguishable, because in fact, the letters were very sexual. They talk about their love games. They talk about flagellating one another. They talk about all these kinky goes. Now, of course, these are fascinating to us now. But
yeah, I'm thinking you could resell that.
At the time, didn't want to have anything to do with this.
Yeah.
So it took a 20th century biographer, Susan Chitty, to come along after the fact to actually dig out these letters and quote them in full and write a biography called Charles Kingsley, the Beast and the Monk, because he was both. He was a bestial man, but he's also a priest. You get a very mixed view of this still very talented man, but ordinary from certain respects, and certainly, well, up to a few tricks in the bedroom, which the widow didn't let on about when she was writing about him in the 1870s, did she?
That's so interesting. It's fascinating. I have a collection of biographies I always mean to get to, but never do. And one is about Francisco Goya, the painter.
Yeah.
And it's by Robert Hughes.
Yeah.
And I noticed that within the last, I want to guess maybe 5 or 6 years, somebody else came out with a biography about Goya. And I reached out to her. I haven't been able to coordinate a conversation, but I was, my primary question was going to be, I'm really interested in what makes you read a biography about someone and say, well, that's not complete.
Yeah.
And what kind of drives you, and that beast and the monk thing kind of encapsulates that. Are there biographies that you know of or that people talk about that are sort of, you come upon and you're sort of like, oh, it'd be great to write about that person, but then you read the biography and you're like, oh shit, like that biography seems kind of complete. I can't really touch that subject.
I bet that happened with Charles Kingsley. In fact, at one time I was very interested in writing about him, because I'd read his books since I was a boy and always rather liked things like The Water Babies and so on. But when I read Susan Chitty's book, I thought, no, she's done it.
Yeah. That's probably once a terrible feeling.
More to tell.
Yeah. Yeah, that's got to be devastating.
Yeah.
Interesting. You were saying something earlier about this. I forget what century it was, maybe 18th century proclivity for biography to be sort of out of homage, as you were saying.
In 19th century.
When did things start to shift towards a desire for objectivity, quote unquote, and as you sort of alluded to earlier, sort of like this bringing down off the pedestal?
Well, I think you can trace it through very, very clearly via the crunch. The crunch came with the publication right at the end of the 19th century of something called the Dictionary of National Biography. It was edited by a man called Leslie Stephen, who was the father of the novelist Virginia Woolf. It's very compendious. It's in about 25 volumes, and it tells the story of mostly men, but mostly admirable men from English history. It's quite clear from the publisher's prospectus that it was intended as a kind of collective act of homage. They wanted to build a mausoleum. They wanted to give readers an impression of the whole procession of great men from the British past. It was published right at the end of the 19th century, and it was about as far as you could go with an act of public homage. You couldn't go any further than that. But when Leslie Stephen's daughter, Virginia Woolf, turned her attention to biography, she determined to do it in a completely different way. Now, she admired her father. She was rather in awe of him. But I think that she thought that way of doing biography was boring, unilinear, unsatisfactory, colorless. And she wanted to bring color back into biography. It's very interesting that her sister was a painter. And I think that what's happening is the same thing is happening in literature as is happening in painting. Whereas in the evolution of painting in the late 19th century, you go from realism to impressionism to post-impressionism. So you start off with recognizable delineation of recognizable people. Then the outlines begin to get vaguer, and there's more of an attempt to depict the person as viewed by somebody who's very impressionable. So you don't get, as it were, a photographic depiction of somebody as you might do in the 19th century. That role has been taken over by photography. Painting has to go elsewhere. Painting has to do something else from photography. Painting has to give you an impression of the person as they appear to somebody else, right? So exactly the same thing was happening in biography. Biography ceased to be something like photography and became something much more like impressionist painting. So you've got to get an evolution from fact to impression, and then finally the impression turns into fiction, two Fs, three things turning into one another. Virginia Woolf was terribly interested in writing biography, an art she admired very much. And interestingly, she wrote 3 books which she called biographies, but they're very different. The first one she published in 2006, and it's called Orlando. It's a biography of her girlfriend, Vita Sackville-West, who was also a novelist and a poet and a famous gardener. Virginia was absolutely obsessed by this woman and admired her very much and wanted to write a book about her. But she found that she was so stirred up emotionally by Vita Sackville-West, she couldn't really produce an objective portrait of her. So what emerged was something called Orlando, a biography, which is actually a novel which takes Orlando, or Vita Sackville-West, through from the Elizabethan period to the modern period. She makes her move through time from the Elizabethan period to the 17th century, the Puritan period, to the 18th century and to the 19th century, and on to the modern age. And halfway through that process, in the middle of the 17th century, she changes sex from a man to a woman. So, I mean, from the point of view of the actual representation of literal truth, it's useless. You never read Orlando in order to find out what kind of person Vita Sackville-West was, but from the point of view of trying to get an impression of how Virginia Woolf regarded her, how Virginia Woolf reacted to this woman, then Orlando is fine. But it's not biography. It's biography which has turned itself into a novel.
That's so interesting. And you said, I'm sorry, when was Orlando published? I think you might have said 2006.
1906.
1906.
1906, yeah.
I was, okay.
Sorry, I got the wrong date. 1906. I get my
1906.
centuries muddled up nowadays. So this is on the cusp of the 20th century, okay? And so you've got the Dictionary of National Biography published at the end of the Victorian period. And in the Edwardian period, what happens is the new biography comes along. Virginia Woolf actually wrote a novel, an essay called The New Biography, talking about new trends in biography. And she's practicing this art herself. She's turning biography into a sort of fiction. And so you can see that the two genres are coming together.
Interesting. That reminds me of, I read when I was in Leeds, as a matter of fact, I had to read the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas.
Yeah. Yeah.
By of course, not Alice B. Toklas.
Yeah, exactly. My girlfriend.
Right.
Yeah. The second book that Virginia Woolf published, this is 1933, was called Flush, a biography. And this is a biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dog. It's very strange. Now, have you read a biography of a dog before? It's a kind of joke. It's a joke biography. So she wrote a book called Orlando, which is a loving, impressionistic portrait of her girlfriend. She wrote a humorous biography of a dog. But right at the end of her life, in 1940, she was commissioned by the family to write a biography of a man called Roger Fry, who was an artist, friend of hers who recently died. And the family made it plain that what they wanted was nothing impressionistic. They wanted a straightforward biography that stuck to the facts. In fact, something rather more like Victorian biography. And Virginia Woolf struggled with that for years and hated doing it. And the result was a flop because she was obliged to stick to the facts. And she didn't like sticking into the fact because she was a creative artist. She was used to transforming fact into impression, verging on fiction. But when obliged to write something that was drably factual, it didn't work for her at all.
Interesting. What you were talking about with Orlando struck me as being weirdly, maybe not similar, but there were some parallels between what she did with Orlando, sort of dragging that through history, and what her father did, sort of having this procession through history.
Yes.
As opposed to a group of individuals. In his case, she had one individual, which seemed really interesting.
Yes. Oh, it's written rather like a succession of acts. She brings the curtain down on one century, and then she opens the curtain on the next century. And everybody's dressed differently. Everybody's talking differently. The manners have shifted. She, like her father, she was very interested in historical transition. I think that's something she inherited from her dad. But it's all done within the lifespan of one individual, which paradoxically stretches across centuries. So it's a very revolutionary act of sort of artistic biography verging on fiction, and it's very difficult to tell which it is, actually.
I understand that literary people might resent this question, but do you have a sense, knowing obviously a lot more than I do you have a sense of what Virginia Woolf might have been trying to do there? Do you think there's something, I mean, if I had to just take a guess at it, I wonder if she's trying to nod towards the timelessness of her friend. Is that too simple?
Absolutely, yes.
Interesting.
Very interested in time, in transcending time. But I think she was experimenting. quite deliberately experimenting. And she might very well have started trying to write an orthodox conventional biography and then found it was completely impossible, you know. Because she was a great creative artist, she was used to transforming things, changing things. So in the process of writing about her friend, she turned her friend into something else, but she also turned biography into something else, much closer to fiction. Although it's described on the title page as biography, it's quite obviously a novel. And nowadays it would be taught in a novel course and shelved on the fiction shelf or of a bookshelf. But the very fact that, you know, you've got something which is, as it were, generically ambiguous, shows you that in fact these generic distinctions are beginning to break down in the early 20th century.
Interesting.
Continue to break down.
I forget the subject of Orlando. What is her name again?
Vita Sackville West.
Vita?
Vita.
You were using friend and girlfriend interchangeably. Were they romantic or was it just platonic or?
It was mostly platonic, but you know, I think they were sexually involved because they were both bisexual.
Interesting. I don't remember.
Married.
Sorry.
They were both married.
Okay.
But they were both bisexual.
Interesting. And I'm sorry if this isn't necessarily, I know this is just one point that you were sort of studying, but I'm very interested in this. What do you do with the sort of androgynous shift in the middle of the book there? You said she changes sex, right?
I haven't actually got the text with me. What's interesting is, in fact, that the term genre is etymologically related to the term gender. So what's happening in this book is the genre is shifting, but the gender shifts as well.
Interesting. Do you have any? Is that speculative that she might have been playing with the etymology of that word, or is that, can that be backed up in any letters or correspondences?
She doesn't say that herself. Laura
That's
Martin, who was a friend of mine and a student of biography and professor at Oxford, who died a couple of years ago, makes that point in a book that she writes about the biographical form. That's
very interesting. So how far forward has your study? Obviously goes back quite a ways, I think maybe to the 17th century we were beginning at. How far forward do your studies go in this regard?
Well, I mean, I suppose one would call Orlando a modernist work. I'm going forward really to the postmodern period. But what's interesting to me is how you begin to sort this out. I mean, how do you decide what's happening in a given book? And it depends whether you look at it from the point of view of the writer or the reader. There's a critic called Philippe Lejeune, who in 1975 wrote a book called Le Pacte Autobiographique, in which he says that in any given work of biography or autobiography, there's a kind of contract between the reader and the writer, that the writer intends such and such a book and gives the reader to understand that that's what they're getting. I mean, the clearest example would be a literal autobiography. There you've got the author who's undertaking to be the same person as the narrator. In other words, they're writing in their own voice, and they're writing about themselves, the subject. That's the simplest formula. You've got author equals narrator equals subject. But there are all kinds of different combinations. If you've got the author who is the same as the narrator, but they're writing about somebody else, and if that other person exists, what you have is a biography. If that other person doesn't exist, what you've got is a novel. So the generic difference there comes in quite incidental. Did the person exist or not? And you might need actually independent information as the reader to know which. Another combination is this. You've got the author who's actually not quite the narrator, but rather like the narrator. And the subject is a version of both. In other words, the author is writing about somebody who's like themselves, but not actually themselves. The classic example of that is Marcel Proust, who wrote a long novel sequence called La Recherche du Temps Perdu, In Search of Lost Time. And it's written in the first person. And the character in the book is called Marcel, with Proust's own Christian name. And yet, the Marcel who appears in the great novel sequence, although bearing certain similarities with the historical Marcel Proust, in certain respects is completely different. So again, you get a gender change, for example. I just read you a passage from volume 5 of La Recherche du Temps Perdu. It's called La Prisonnière, this volume, and he's talking in this particular passage. The narrator is talking about the fact that his girlfriend, whom he calls Albertine, has moved into his flat in Paris. And he's talking about how nice it is at last to have Albertine under the same roof as himself.
And Robert, before you begin, my French is good enough to know the title, In Search of Lost Time, but that the title of the volume, can you translate that?
La Prisonnière, which is translated as the captive.
Okay.
Okay, that's in the Got Moncrief translation, which is the one published shortly afterwards. There are different translations, but I'm using this classic English translation. When I reflect now that my mistress had come on our return from Baalbek to live in Paris under the same roof as myself, that she had abandoned the idea of going on a cruise, that she was installed in a bedroom within 20 paces of my own, at the end of the corridor in my father's tapestried study, and that late every night before leaving me, she used to slide her tongue between my lips like a portion of daily bread, a nourishing food that had the almost sacred character of all flesh, upon which the sufferings that we had endured on its account have come in time to confer a sort of spiritual grace. What I had once called to mind, in comparison, is not the night that Captain de Borodino allowed me to spend in the barracks, a favor which cured what was after all only a passing distemper, but the night on which my father sent Mama to sleep in the little bed by the side of my own. So it is that life, if it is once again to deliver us from an anguish that has seemed inevitable, does so in conditions that are different, so diametrically opposed at times that it is almost an open sacrilege to assert the identity of the grace bestowed upon us. So he's talking about having his girlfriend, called Albertine, in the flat with him. And it recollects the pleasant feelings that he had as a young boy when he was able to share a bed with his mother. Now, do in fact know that this episode is partly based on an episode in Proust's life, but the Albertine character was not a woman at all, but a man. And the real life model for Albertine was Alfred Agostinelli, who was Proust's male chauffeur.
Wow.
So he's changed the gender. He's changed a boy into a girl. And it's part of his vision. He does that quite a lot during the course of the book. So again, you've got a genre divide, which has become a gender divide. He's playing the same sort of things. In some ways, it's rather similar to what Woolf is doing in Orlando.
That's so interesting. I know it's two examples, but that they both flip the gender there.
Yeah.
Of people that they're romantically interested in.
Yeah.
Is interesting. Do you think is it too simple to chalk that up to an interest in the audience and a sensitivity to what their sensibilities might be?
It's very well done. I mean, I read À la recherche de temps perdu when I was really quite young. And because I'm a heterosexual male, I was very interested in Albert, and I found her very, very attractive. So it rather shocked me when several years later on, I read a 2-volume biography of Marcel Proust by a man called George D. Painter, in which he made it quite clear that Albertine was actually a man. But it's done very, very convincingly. So if it's done from the point of view of the heterosexual reader, such as myself, it's very convincing. It's an act of disguise, but it's an act of disguise which he pulls off very well, I think. It could be, of course, if you think back to the period when these books were written. I mean, Orlando, published in 1906, La Prisonnière, published in 1923, that there was an element of censorship.
Right.
That it was very difficult to portray a homosexual relationship in fiction without getting into trouble. I mean, I think there's partly that element, but also I think that the author is playing tricks with his or her sexuality. Actually, is interested in the ambivalence of their own reactions to this person, and is also interested in their own personal gender makeup. You know, that Proust was very interested in the psychological constitution of the homosexual man, and in fact he writes 2 whole volumes called Sodom and Gomorrah, really about the condition of homosexuality in both men and women. And Virginia Woolf too was intensely aware, I think, of her hybrid sexuality, and she's partly using the novel form to explore that.
Interesting. And Sodom and Gomorrah, you said, was by Proust?
Yeah.
Interesting. When you were reading about, when were you doing most of your research on Proust?
Oh, that was about 30 years ago. So
Okay.
that's quite some time ago. I wasn't so much interested in this aspect of his work. I was more interested in the way that he'd reacted to English literature. So I wrote a book called Proust and the Victorians that came out in 1994. But I've begun to see him more in terms of, literary history, and in this, in the evolution and blending and separation of these forms. But what has happened, I think, since Proust and Virginia Woolf is that the 2 forms have blended so absolutely that occasionally it's very difficult to tell what kind of book you're reading. And this can be a bit disturbing. You see, Philippe Lejeune, when he was talking about Le Pacte Autobiographique, and we're talking about a contract between the writer and the reader, assumed that both of them were in good faith, that the writer would never mislead the reader. And if the writer was taking the reader across generic boundaries, he would make it quite clear that that was what was happening. And that's certainly true with Virginia Woolf. I mean, when she plays games with Vita Sackville West Identity, it's clear what's happening. And she closes the curtains, she parts them again. He indicates what's happening.
Hmm.
But what I think has happened since the mid to late 20th century is that increasingly authors have started playing tricks with the reader to deceive the reader or to bamboozle the reader. So the reader really isn't clear, what kind of book he or she is reading. And this is where it becomes slightly sinister sometimes. I mean, I think two examples of it I can talk about. The first one is Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, who was brought up in Russia, had to leave Russia during the revolution, fled to the West, from Paris to Berlin, and then to America, and changed language too. His first 7 novels were in Russian, and then he started writing in English. And during the course of his life, wrote a series of books that they purport to be autobiographies, but it's very unclear what is fact and what is fiction. And if you read them, it seems to me what's happening is Nabokov is playing with you. He doesn't want you to know. He wants you to be perplexed. He wants you to be intrigued. He wants you to wonder in your mind where the boundary between fact and fiction lies. And sometimes he deliberately misleads you. There are 3 books that he published with a very strong autobiographical content. The first one was called Dar, in Russian, translated as The Gift. That was published in 1938, translated in 1963. Second one was called Pale Fire, in English, in 1963. Then he published a biography called Speak Memory, that originally he wrote in Russian and then translated into English. That purports to be a straightforward biography, but clearly he's shifting around. And towards the end of his life, he wrote a novel drawing on his life history called Look at the Harlequins. Now, really, if you didn't know much about Nabokov, you would mistake that for an autobiography. But as soon as you get to know about Nabokov's actual life, you realize that he's playing tricks. For example, in the first paragraph, he says, I've been married 4 times. Nabokov was only married once. He actually introduces Vladimir Nabokov into the book as a character. So you think, my God, is this by Nabokov? Is about Nabokov? If it's about Nabokov's life, what's he doing in the book as another character? So the boundaries are shifting. And whereas Virginia Woolf, I think, would let the reader know what was happening, Nabokov doesn't let the reader know what's happening. He's playing tricks with the reader. He's producing a kind of quagmire that's part fact, part fiction. I think an even more extreme example of that is much more recent. Sebald, have you read anything by W. Sebald?
No.
He died in 2001. He was German, born in 1944. He came over to England, where he was a lecturer in German literature at East Anglia University. And he wrote a succession of works that are purportedly autobiographical, but are in practice highly unreliable, even deceitful. And the generic blending in these books is so extreme that I don't think you could go even further. I just talk about one of them, which was written originally in German under the title Schwindelgefühle, translated into English as vertigo. And in this case, the vertigo, I think, could be taken to refer to the reader's reaction, because the book contains, firstly, a potted biography of the French novelist Stendhal in one section. A potted biography of the German writer Franz Kafka in another section, in which Kafka, in fact, turns into a character in one of his own stories. A potted biography of the famous seducer Casanova. And finally, two sections of a parent's memoir, both describing journeys, but in which the circumstances are radically transformed, people transposed, events change. So what is this? Is this biography? Is it memoir? Is it autobiography? Is it fiction? You'll find it on the fiction shelves in the bookshelf, but in fact, it contains elements of all of these genres. And it's not clear, although it's sectionalized, what is fiction and what is fact. For example, the section on Franz Kafka that is set actually in a town called Riva on the northern bank of Lake Garda in Italy starts off as a day-by-day account of a holiday that Kafka actually spent in that town. But as it goes on, it turns into a short story written by Kafka. So is it fact? Is it fiction? Is it biography? Is it a bit of a novel? And then when it gets to the, for example, the last but one, as it were, pseudo-autobiographical section, he describes a return journey back to the town where he grew up in Alpine, in Bavaria, called Wertach. And he talked about the people that he knew as a child. He talks about his family. He talks about his childhood experience. But he's mixed it all up. He's transposed people. He's called people something else. He's moved things around so effectively that nobody who grew up in that town at that time recognizes themselves or recognizes him. In fact, a number of the people who survived from that period and remember him from his childhood were deeply disturbed by this book. And when last year, Carole Angier wrote a biography of Sebald called Speak Silence, she investigated all of this, and she concluded that in fact the memoir section of the book is just a tissue of lies. So what's going on here? Is he lying? Is this deceitful? Is this fiction? Is a biography turning into fiction? So the reader really doesn't know where to turn. They don't know what kind of book they're reading. And the result is, as the title says, a feeling of vertigo, of being lost, generically lost.
It's fascinating. Is it important to make a distinction between what I might call an artistic biography, all the people that you've cited so far, or in the recent movement of our conversation, Woolf, Proust, Nabokov, and is it what is it? Sebald?
Sebald, yes.
Sebald. They're all capital A artists as far as I'm concerned, right? And no offense to the more common biographer, but someone who's just trying to do a biography on,
common job, yes.
Right. Those seem to have, I would imagine they're divergent, right?
The aims, the intention is different.
Well, yeah, I would imagine. I'm thinking of the people who I don't want to straw man them or their books, but somebody's in office, there's a big scandal, or something's not clear, and then it's sort of there's an economy or an exchange that's very clear. Somebody might have access to information or is a journalist and they want to dig for this information. They provide the public that, even if it's not the whole story, more of the story than they were given. And as an exchange, it's on the New York Times bestseller for a few weeks, and then it kind of disappears to history.
Yeah.
Maybe it gets replaced in 10 years when another thing comes out about
Yeah.
the scandal, or it disappears entirely. That seems very different than like what Wolf was doing or what Proust was doing with the genre of biography. I guess what I'm trying to say is you have these sort of like these attempts at straight shots at biography throughout
Yeah.
history or throughout recent history, from what I can remember. And then you have these artistic takes of sort of
Yeah.
like playing with the genre.
Yeah.
It
Yes,
has
I
to
think
be,
you're
it has to be almost impossible for you to study both simultaneously, right? Are you paying more attention to the more artistic plays on the genre, or are you also
I'm
thinking about
interested
the common?
because I teach life writing actually in classes in London. I'm very interested in what people can do with the form.
Hmm.
So experimentation with the form, in fact, interests me a lot. So I think there's a slight discrepancy between my own practice as a biographer and what I teach.
Hmm.
I don't exactly practice what I teach.
Sure.
Because I published 2 straight biographies, both of 20th century poets. In both cases, I was writing under the watchful eye of the widow,
Hmm.
who wished me to stick to the facts, just as Roger Fry's family wished Virginia Woolf to stick to the facts. And so I've written a couple of biographies which are as objective as I can make them, because they had to be, partly for moral reasons, partly for legal reasons. I couldn't go around changing things when people were alive. They get very, very upset.
Sure.
The advantage of that is the life is recognizable, or at least recognizable to most people who knew the person and read the book. The disadvantage is, of course, that there's a sort of built-in obsolescence there. When the person dies, other papers are revealed. As time goes on, more is revealed. People die. People's memories change. Audience tastes changes. Authorial practice changes. So you can never have a final definitive biography of anybody if it's pretending to be an objective biography, because as tastes change and as practices change and as more material becomes available, so it becomes necessary either to revise the biography or to write a new one. And the new one is normally written by somebody else. So there's a chance, for example, I've written a biography of George Barker, one of David Gascoigne, that in 50 years somebody may come along and say, oh, Fraser is old hat, we didn't have to pay any attention, he was running way back in the 21st century. Let's get up to date. So a 22nd century biography may come along and shape the whole thing very, very differently. There is a built-in obsolescence, which of course is not true of what you call the artistic biography. I mean, people have published the biographies of Peter Sackville West, but they don't replace Orlando, because Orlando isn't, as it were, a pseudo-objective biography. It's a work of art. And whereas biography is transient and eventually, die and is dispensable, works of art are not dispensable. By turning it into something closer to fiction, closer to art, in a sense, you redeem it, you save it from time. Whereas the actual, as it were, common or garden straightforward biography is always going to get to seem dated. But works of art don't date in the same way.
Interesting. I might have said this in our last conversation, but within the past year, I did something of a deep dive on James Joyce.
Yeah.
Just reading through his work, not necessarily even touching any of his biographies. But I read a little bit around it, and it was fascinating to see that confluence. It would be fascinating to imagine him having written an autobiography, but you could imagine it being almost interminable. And yet, Portrait of the Artist and Ulysses especially,
Yeah.
seem to be autobiographical enough, and yet still artistic, as he said, to
Yeah,
have that timelessness to them.
they
Um,
do.
and there are even parts where a reader could say, he acknowledges that, how to put this? There's this line where he sort of says, I think it's all in all of us. And he talks about how there's a part of the author in every character.
Yeah,
And while that character might be based off of someone who's real, whatever happens to that character is sort of through the lens of the author. And
yeah,
so the author's life is sort of refracted in a novel. And I think you see that with Proust, right?
yeah,
It's sort of refracted countless times in all the different characters, and together bring this impressionistic
yeah.
sense of the author together. It's really bizarre to think about. I don't know if you've read with any interest, Joyce, but there's a there's a scene where, of course, Stephen Dedalus is sort of this Joycean character,
Yeah,
but there's this scene where he gets thrown out of a Stephen gets thrown out of a brothel,
yeah,
and then picked up, of course, by Bloom, who sort
yeah,
of like defends him from the guards, um, the British soldiers, and and Bloom, Stephen Dedalus is, of course, this very Catholic figure, and Bloom is this Jewish figure, and apparently Joyce himself was thrown out of a brothel,
yeah,
got into a bit of a scrape, and then was picked up and sort of dusted off and brought in for safe harbor by this Jewish man. And it sort of, from what I understand, Joyce had not a crisis of faith, but a realization of a common humanity sort of subverting faith. And it's amazing to see that fictionalized when you, okay, wow, that when I found out that something like that happened, it brought a flavor to that scene that I don't know if
yeah.
I would have looked back on it. I don't know if I would have looked back on it the same way had it been entirely fictionalized.
Yeah. Well, there's a process of transformation going on. I mean, Ulysses is nominally set in Dublin, but it was written in Trieste. Do you know Trieste?
Only
It's a
because
kind
of
of liminal city. It used to be Austrian, now it's Italian. Interesting little place. But actually, we went for a holiday in Trieste about 3 years ago. And going around, it's quite obvious that Ulysses is actually set in Trieste. It's Trieste dressed up as Dublin.
Wow. I've never heard that.
No. Well, I think it's true. I don't know if it's ever been said, but I have a sense that there's a strong sort of continental flavor to Ulysses, and it's coming from that, and a number of people whom Joyce worked with in Trieste actually appear in the book, again in disguised forms. But as you say, nothing is going to supersede Ulysses.
Right.
But every biography of Joyce, such as Richard Ellman, for example, which is the classic one, is going to be superseded sooner or later. I mean, when I first started writing on Proust, the principal biography was this chap I talked about, George D. Painter, who I actually corresponded with at the time and encouraged me. And I thought that was, about as definitive a biography as you could get. But since that time, there have been 4 or 5 biographies. The best one now, and most compendious, is by a man called Jean-Yves Tadier, and it's far better than Painter, far better than Painter. And the mistake that Painter made, and I can talk about this now, the man is dead, is that he assumed an almost one-to-one relationship between the characters in the book and people whom Proust actually knew and mixed with in Paris. So it's, he would say, oh, Albertine equals Agostinelli. And in fact, he has 2 indexes, one of the fictional people and one of the, as it were, the factual people. But it's not like that. It's much more complicated than that, because most of the characters in A La Recherche de Temps Perdu are a mixture between different people. They're partly Proust himself, they're partly people he knows. He changes the gender. You cannot have a simple one-to-one equal relationship across that boundary. It's much more fluid than the painter was so interested in identifying the various personalities as they turned up in the book, that I think he made the mistake of almost literalizing it. Whereas Jean-Yves Cartier's age is much more complicated than that. Everybody is a mixture of various human types. But that's a kind of postmodern take, I suppose, on Proust. But as time goes on, I'm sure there'll be other biographies of Proust which will do him a different way, just as there will be other biographies of Barker and Gascoigne who'll do it a different way. But what's of interest to me now, I suppose, is particularly thinking about Sebald. I mean, his bringing together of fact and fiction, of biography and the novel, is so absolute. It's difficult to see how it can go any further. So as time goes on and we drift through this particular century, what's going to happen? Are the two forms going to drift apart again? Or is it rather, as I suspect, rather like a concertina? The forms are very different, very distinct, and then they're brought together again. This sort of in-out, bellowed sort of movement as the forms diverge, and then they converge again. So what we've done this afternoon is to talk about a situation in which they were almost indistinguishable from one another in the 18th century. Then a period, the 19th century, the Victorian period, where they came apart, and we saw how during the 20th century they gradually came together again, so that now, again, they're almost indistinguishable. But I think the difference between now and the 18th century is this. In the 18th century, the two genres hadn't, as it were, successfully separated themselves out in the first instance. The novel and biography were not so defined that they couldn't be combined, so that it wasn't a deliberate act of fusion, just that these two forms had grown up together and occasionally, and as it were accidentally, formed hybrid unions. But in the 19th century, the forms separated out from one another, and this is partly a matter of authorial intention. It's partly something to do with the evolution of the book trade, because in the 19th century, booksellers turned into large publishing houses, and large publishing houses tended to specialize, and they published different lists. So they'd have a fiction list, and they'd have a biography list, and never the twain did meet. A book would appear either as a novel, or it would appear as biography. And people were very, very unhappy that there was any kind of melding. And again, libraries would shelve books in different sections, and bookshelves, booksellers would have different sections, one for biography, one for fiction, one for travel, and so on. So there was, as it were, a sound commercial reason why during the 19th and early 20th century, these forms should remain distinct. It had a commercial rationale as well as having an artistic rationale. But now it seems to me that these things are coming together again, but not in the same way as in the 18th century, because the forms hadn't separated themselves out in the first instance. Now we know what a novel is and what a biography is. And so the fusion that I've been talking about, the latterly, has been a deliberate act of bringing two different things together as a willed artistic act, which reaches extreme forms in people like Nabokov and Sebald. I thought Sebald knew very, very well what the difference was between fact and fiction, but he was deliberately bringing them together and deliberately confusing the reader. I don't think Defoe was.
There appears to me this interesting categorical issue. I have a that might be similar to if I tell somebody I like country music, they immediately imagine this sort of pop country, sort of this kind of music that I might hate. But then if I say that I like Americana or folk, or as my one buddy calls outlaw country, then you start to sound a little pretentious. What do you, as someone interested in biography and fiction, what do you think of that, a genre that I might, or a subgenre that I might occasionally hear sort of as creative memoir? Do you think that people just trying to split the difference between the two? Do you put any stock in that, or is the real separation for you between biography and fiction?
Yes, well, I have taught courses in something called creative nonfiction. Creative nonfiction, I think, is as a paradox in the extreme. I mean, it's almost a contradiction.
Sure.
But I've taught this, and it seems to me that it's really it's interesting, it's experimental, and I think it's quite a promising form. I think there's a difference between memoir and autobiography. Autobiography is all about putting down things that happened. Memoir, as the name suggests, is about memory. Now, everybody knows that memory plays tricks.
Right.
My life is different as I go through it. I mean, the childhood that I can recall now is different from the childhood that I recalled in my 30s. Because my brain cells have changed. I've changed as a person. I used to live in Africa in my early 20s, and I went there. I taught for about 5 years in a university in Africa. And about 30 years later, I went back, and I found that my reaction to this African country was completely different. The country had changed, but the most important thing was that I changed as well. So memoir is maybe by definition an experimental form, because it's playing with memory, and memory is malleable. And because it's malleable, it's amenable to experimentation. So I don't think that in a creative memoir, you're lying. What you're being true to is not to the facts, but to your memory of the facts. And the reader understands that memory plays tricks, not deceitful tricks, but as you change, the way you remember changes. And as long as you're true to your memories, then you're writing a true memoir. That maybe is the difference between fact and truth.
This seems very apropos, but if I'm remembering this correctly, I believe Toni Morrison has an essay about writing and memories. I forget what she calls it, but I think there's something about her going back to a house or going back to a hill and remembering it being enormous when she was a child, but then going back to it as an adult and realizing how not enormous it was.
So the scale of everything changes.
Right. And she had this dilemma that I think she records in this essay about what would be more truthful, to record it as I remember and record it as being sort of a massive thing, or recording it as it is, which is, just a hill or just a house.
Well, I mean, you can do both, I suppose, or maybe you could do the two things side by side. But
yeah, that's interesting.
There's such a thing as absolute truth in memoir.
Yeah, you could imagine an essay or a book or something where you write about the scale of the thing, and then in the next paragraph or so, you sort of, there's this, not a great reveal, but that sort of reveal of how things change, and sort of you going back and it being much smaller than you remember.
Yeah. Well, Nabokov did call one of his attempts at an autobiography Speak Memory, listening to my memory. And interesting that Carol Angier last year published a biography of Sebald. He called it Speak Silence.
Interesting.
Because she realized that Sebald was a chap who hid,
Hmm.
He didn't tell the truth. He hid, he played tricks, he was very foxy. He was that kind of guy, There's a difference, I think, between remembering something in a different way and deliberately changing something.
Hmm.
If it's a willed act of adulteration, then it is close to deceit. The memory plays tricks, but it's not deceitful. It's much closer to transformation, mutation, than it is to, deceit or lying. Memory tells its own kind of truth, I think.
That's interesting. But it's hard to parse out sometimes where an author is coming from on that spectrum, if the author is sort of being deceitful or if the author is almost like some sort of oracle to their memories or, to their impressions. That might sound a little dramatic, but I'm thinking of, there's this awesome film. I don't know if Fellini made it, but it's about Fellini as a director, Federico Fellini, and it's called Born a Liar.
Yeah.
And it's all about how he was just this chronic liar growing up.
Right.
And he, of course, found, a medium in film that allowed him to lie productively. And I think it was, Joyce in Portrait of the Artist, that the scene opens up with, if you remember, the sort of his father telling him a story about a moo cow.
Yeah.
And then within the next page or two, you have Joyce, the character as a child, Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's character as a child, sort of manipulating that story. Yeah. And so one way of reading that might be that you have, if it is a portrait of the artist, that the artist, what the artist does, if it is somewhat innate, almost instinctively manipulates things, manipulates stories, manipulates characters, sort of mirrors themselves into characters. And I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, Stephen does something with the moo cow that mirrors his own experience.
Yes.
And so I wonder if it's that conspiratorial that, the author is playing tricks, so to speak, or, if it's much more instinctual than that.
Or is it more like dreaming?
Right.
Every night you dream and you recognize what's happening in your dream, and you're convinced that it's immediate, that it's happening here and now. And then you wake up and two things strike you. Firstly, you realize that it was all fiction, that it in fact didn't happen. But also there's an awful lot about it that you recognize. Right. And I suppose this is one justification between behind the Freudian interpretation of dreams. Dreams are, a muddle. They are a distortion, but they contain their own kind of truth. So again, it's really a distinction between truth and facts, and I don't think they're the same thing. I don't think you can have an untrue dream. You can have a dream which is factually incorrect, but you can't have a dream which in some sense doesn't tell you the truth about you.
Interesting. And how interesting is it that you don't have dreams that are simply memories, right? It doesn't feel like a camera.
No, I don't think it ever does, really.
And
Nor does it ever strike you when you're dreaming that this is false.
Right.
Part of the whole experience of dreaming is a deep conviction that what you're experiencing is there. It's immediate. It's authentic. And then you wake up and you realize that it isn't. You have a waking self and a dreaming self. And the dreaming self is absolutely convinced about the validity of what's occurring.
So too is maybe your waking self, right? If you've ever had the experience of thinking you're falling deeply in love, or
Yeah.
thinking that something's going really well or something that's going really not well, right? And then
Yeah.
suddenly, you're engrossed in that situation, you're engrossed in that reality, and then the same that you were saying about the biographies, time changes, it reveals things, you know, your 30-year-old self remembers that country
Yeah.
differently than, 30 years later or so. It's fascinating. I also think what's gripping about dreams might be true about what's gripping about art. And I know that's a really high in the sky sentence, but that what seems really interesting about dreams is that the the facts of the dream, that is the things that are recognizable about your
Yeah.
reality in the dream, seem really gripping, but they're also gripping because they're coupled with this not true element, right? There's enough that's familiar that makes it gripping. And there's
Yeah.
also enough that's unfamiliar that makes it gripping. I heard somebody talk about Harry Potter once
Yeah.
in regards to Americans and say,
Yeah.
how how charming and seductive for Americans to think, Americans who might grow up going to public school, it's like suddenly you go up and you go to this boarding school, and instead of playing soccer, you're playing Quidditch, and
Yeah.
instead of studying chemistry, you're studying charms, and
Yeah.
it's recognizable enough for it to be sort of enticing, and it's also different enough for it to be, either even further enticing. I wonder if dreams and art do something very similar.
I don't know. I live on the outskirts of the city of Oxford, and city of Oxford lives on its past, I think. But there's a Harry Potter shop in the middle of the town, because the Harry Potter films were partly shot in Oxford.
I didn't know that.
No. And there's this boarding school. What's the boarding school called? I can't remember.
Hogwarts.
Hogwarts, that's right. But Hogwarts, the Hogwarts sequences are set in an Oxford college. The dining hall of Hogwarts is, in fact, the dining hall of Christ Church College.
Wow.
Oxford. And all throughout the summer, you get streams of Americans who come and they want to go to Christ Church,
right,
to see the Hogwarts dining hall. And they're kind of caught up in this fantasy, which they obviously very much enjoy. It's as if they're play acting, but they absolutely love it. And of course, it's very good for the city of Oxford because it's very commercially successful. And all this merchandise is sold on the back of Harry Potter.
I have an Australian. When I was in Leeds, I lived with a bunch of Australians, and I had an Australian friend visit, and he's a big Australian football fan, so he's used to stadiums and athletic competitions and all that sort of thing. But I took him to a baseball game.
Yeah.
And he was just totally mesmerized by, at once, how relatable it was. You have a stadium, you have a crowd, you have two teams, but then all the little distinctions, right? Instead of whatever food they eat there, we have hot dogs and hamburgers, and right, and all the little differences just seem so interesting. The little rituals of the crowd. There was something reinvigorating about watching him watch it, right? Where that would have been me just going to the ball game, that I was sort of there with him, and I was like, oh wow, yeah, that is pretty amazing.
Yes, well, I part of our family is American, actually, because my first wife's brother migrated to the United States and had a family over there, as did my brother. So there are two groups of family members, all of whom are cousins of my son. And he's been over in America at Christmas. He made the mistake of going to New York for Christmas this year, which wasn't a very good idea in minus 40 degrees centigrade, and he nearly perished. But members of that family do come, or either family come over here. It's very interesting to watch them watching England. So everything that strikes you as being very ordinary or boring is to them unbelievably exotic.
Yeah. Well, you commented on my hat at the beginning of our call, and I remember being in Leeds, and I think I was wearing a flannel, and I had a hat on, and I was somewhere in the university, and I was trying to find the bathroom, and I asked for the bathroom. And this professor sort of like perked up when they saw me and heard me, and they thought, I forget what they said, but they replaced my word and they were sort of like,
Yeah,
do you mean the toilet or whatever they said? And I was, yeah.
yeah.
And they're like, are you American? And I was like, what gave me away, you know?
And you use the word freezer meaning a fridge, don't you? We call it a fridge. You call it a freezer, am I right?
Well, yeah, we have we have the fridge and the freezer. The fridge is the, doesn't freeze things. It
Oh,
just
I
keeps
see.
them cool.
Okay,
Which one
right.
does the freezing for you?
But we have the same distinction. But when I was about 22, I went and lived for a couple of months in Paris, in a
Mm,
place called Shakespeare and Company. You've heard of Shakespeare and Company?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, they were the first people to publish, of course, Ulysses, I mean, but
Mm,
there's a man called George Whitman, who is actually the illegitimate great-grandson or something of Walt Whitman, who in
yeah.
1953 set up something called Shakespeare and Company. It's not the original Shakespeare and Company, it's in a
Mm,
different place. It actually faces Notre Dame across the Seine. And the deal is, if you're interested in literature, you can go and work there. It doesn't pay you,
mm.
but he picks you up. Now, I mean, he died a few years ago, and his daughter Sylvia, named after Sylvia Beach, has taken it over. But I went and I worked there for about 2 months, and was given board and lodging, and met a lot of interesting writers like Lawrence Starr and that kind of thing. And he used to make me dinner, and he used to go and tell me to fetch the food, and he said, it's in the freezer. And he meant the fridge. And so I was walking around looking for a deep freeze, but I couldn't see a deep freeze. So I said, there isn't a freezer here, but there's a freezer in the corner. And actually it was the fridge. So he was just complete misunderstanding, but he was a
So
lovely
fun.
man.
If I remember correctly, yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell, but he wrote what's called the Skeleton's Key to Finnegan's Wake,
Oh, yes.
and he smuggled in one of the blue copies of Ulysses. I believe he was at Shakespeare and Co. And I think he talks about Sylvia. I can't remember if that's correct or not.
Yeah.
But a woman who was the editor or took over Shakespeare and Co. I wonder who that was. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, I'm aware of our time. I have a stack of biographies that I've always meant to get to. I almost imagine a summer where I just read biographies. I,
That's good.
I couldn't pass up the opportunity to ask you, now that you're sort of knee deep in this study, what biographies or not biographies would you add to my list?
Gosh.
I'll tell you, I can tell you who I have here. I have a
Okay.
biography on Goya,
Yeah.
a biography on Fellini,
Yeah.
and a biography on Darwin. So the field's wide open.
Okay. Who wrote the one about Darwin?
Let me check. Adrian Desmond and James Moore.
Yeah, I've got that one. That came out about 30 years ago. That's quite an old one, isn't it, really?
Hmm.
Yeah.
What would you add to my list here?
If you want a biography of Proust, I think Jean-Yves Tadier is the best one, actually, really, now. Have a look at this biography of Sebald by Carol Angier, Speak Silence. It's very interesting because it gives rise to all kinds of speculations about the borderland between fact and fiction. I mean, one thing we hadn't talked about is, of course, the legal implications of the difference. I mean, she's concerned about that because, writers do get into trouble occasionally.
Sure.
And the standard disclaimer at the beginning of a biography, there's a page saying, this is a work of fiction, and all the people in it are characters and are not based on anybody living. That's an attempt to get around the legal loophole, which you're always worried about, of course, if you're writing a novel which includes people. I mean, in my novel, The Quality of the Light, I do include one of my uncles, but he's safely dead. The interesting thing about him is I actually never met him. So I was always fascinated by this guy. So I wrote a book about him.
What's interesting about that disclaimer is that it almost seems to always be not true. Like
Yeah,
it seems like a lie that would be in
yeah,
front of so many books. Maybe not every time, but if you line up 100 books,
yeah.
that can't always be true.
Well, yes, but yeah. Well, I don't think that publishers would ask authors to put that there unless they were worried.
Hmm.
I mean, there had been legal cases. I mean, just up the road here is a place called Banbury, and in Banbury Grammar School, which no longer exists, the novelist Anthony Burgess once taught. And in 1960, he wrote a novel called The Worm and the Ring, based on his experience teaching in that school, in which he claimed that the character, more or less based on himself, was having an affair with the school secretary, who was married at the time. Now, this was read shortly after publication by the actual secretary of Banbury Grammar School, and she made sure that a solicitor's letter was sent to the publishers, who were Heinemann, and they withdrew the book. They said they were going to change it and then reissued, but in fact they pulped it, so it was not reissued with the alterations until 1970. So I mean, there had been cases in which people have been taken to court, you know. Olivia Manning, she was an English novelist who I very much admire, who died in 1980. She wrote a couple of trilogies, the Balkan trilogy and the Levantine trilogy, based on her experiences during the Second World War. She was married to a man called Reggie Smith, who was a British Council lecturer, and they spent part of the war years in Romania, partly in Greece and partly in Egypt. And she includes both herself and her husband in the book. She changes her own name to Harriet, and she changes Reggie's name to Guy. But nearly everybody in the book, in the novel, is based on people who are actually working in, Romania, Athens or Greece at the time. She got into terrible trouble with some of them. I mean, there was some instance, I was just rereading one of her books recently, in which there's the tragic death of a young child who is throwing pebbles at what he thinks is just a mound in the desert. The mound is in fact a mortar. It goes off, explodes, and the child is killed. Now, she tells this story in the novel, but it actually happened. And the parents, of course, were desperately upset that Olivia Manning had including this episode, which by implication blamed them for neglecting their own child and causing his own death. And she got into terrible trouble. I think a solicitor's letter, I think there was a court case and so on. So it's not innocent, any of this stuff, really. Yeah.
That's interesting. Joan Didion, who I love, she has this great memoir. I think her godchild made it or something, or this little biopic. And it goes through all of her work and records her or some of her editors reading parts of it. It's really cool. But she talks about her and her husband writing about some of their marital difficulties. And of course, she was writing all these sort of autobiographical essays. And she sort of said, as a general rule, her and her husband both being writers, they sort of acknowledged plainly that the subject was whatever they could write about, and whatever they could write about was what they had. So people were surprised, like, oh, wasn't your husband upset that you were writing about your marital difficulties? And she was like, no, it was, we sort of acknowledge that you write what you have. And I imagine that, it's kind of a radical rule for someone who's not thinking about that, right? And if you write about your son dying tragically, I could see people taking offense to that.
Yes, I always was rather upset when people who appeared in memoirs complained about the way that they were portrayed, because I always thought, it's artistic license, it's fair dues. I don't think one should kick up a fuss, kick up a cloud of dust because somebody has seen you in an unflattering light. And I held this attitude firmly until last year when somebody included me in a memoir.
Funny. How did you feel about, what was it like? Yeah, sorry. What was that like reading about yourself?
Well, I insisted it was changed. In fact, I dictated a few substitute paragraphs.
So funny.
About a man called Dambutso Marichera, who was a famous Zimbabwean writer who died about 30 years ago. And it's by a German woman who's a scholar of his work, and also was his lover. But when she was researching the book, which is about 20 years ago, she came to London and she interviewed me in my house with my then wife, who now died, and our young son, who was then about 5, he's now about 35. And when I read it, I was really quite upset because she'd portrayed me as somebody who was very miserable in their first marriage, though in fact I was idyllically happy in my first marriage. And I thought that this was a terrible misrepresentation, not only of me, but of my son and my wife. So I had to say, well, I like the book by and large, and I think it's true to you and your relationship with Dambutso. But I think, you've your portrayal of my first marriage is not true to what it was. And I could see, interestingly, when she visited me 30 years ago, I could tell that she was slightly disdainful, because I lived at that time on the outskirts of London, in a nice house, but in her eyes, a rather mean little house. And she thought that I'd sold off and I was living in sort of petty bourgeois squalor, but I wasn't actually. I was very happy. So, I mean, her view of my marriage and my view of my marriage is totally different, but there we are. But I did want her to change it. I mean, I wouldn't have gone to law. I wouldn't have sent a solicitor's letter. But since I had her ear and since she'd sent me the text, I said, well, look, I think this is not how it was. And I think that the way you portrayed me is a projection of your own attitude, which is one thing you have to be wary of when you're a biographer, that you don't project some of yourself onto the subject. And I felt that that's what she was doing, some of her social disdain, and the fact that her own marriage had broken up, and she was rather sort of mean about somebody whose marriage was still intact. That's what I felt, I'm sure she was doing it in good faith, but I did ask her to change it because I thought it was a distortion of the way things were. And it's certainly true when you are writing a biography, you often do write to people and you send them the relevant chapters. And I say, do you mind?
Sure.
Usually they say that's fine. I mean, I don't mind people saying disparaging things about me because obviously we all have flaws. But on the other hand, I wouldn't want a complete distortion to appear, really, if something wasn't true. And I mean then subjectively true, because I didn't think that she was being true to my first marriage as I saw it. And I thought that was the important thing. If she was being true to her own relationship with this man in the book, she should try and be true to my relationships, which in this case were very warm and tender, but she kind of distorted them in some way. I wasn't happy with that.
We mentioned this guy last time, but I had a professor in Leeds who's a poet, Paul Mattern, who wrote a poem shortly after I left and published it, and I was in it, and my name was mentioned in a paper I'd written for him, and he had changed my name by one letter, and I could not have been more flattered to have been in a piece of published. Yeah, it was so exciting. It's probably at 1.5. It's it's maybe 1.5 lines. It's hardly even a sentence.
Yeah.
But it was very exciting.
Well, it's nice that a friend of mine called Robert Crawford, who's a very fine poet and biographer, who's recently published a biography of T.S. Eliot, which I do recommend. It's in two sets. One is called, the first volume is called, T.S. Eliot from St. Louis to the Wasteland, because he was born in St. Louis, Kentucky, to the wasteland. The second volume, which has just been published, is called T.S. Eliot After the Wasteland. Anyway, he came and he gave a lecture about it and the art of biography in the T.S. Eliot Lecture Theatre in Merton College in Oxford 2 weeks ago. And he invited me along and I came along. And he kept on mentioning me in the lecture, which was very nice because a lot of quite important people were there. So again, like you, I was very flattered to be mentioned in a lecture by T.S. Eliot's biographer in the T.S. Eliot Lecture Theatre in Merton College, where Eliot studied in the 1920s. So I felt that I was on the map a bit.
That's nice. That's nice. Okay, Dr. Fraser, I have to sign off, but I can't thank you enough.
Okay.
Are you trying to, is this all of these studies culminating in a class or a book? What are you working on?
No, I'm writing on a book. I'm working on a book, yeah.
Okay. Do you have a projected, dare I give you the anxiety of admitting this date? Do you have a projected date?
Well, I hope to hand it in on my 77th birthday.
Wow.
I won't tell you when that is. Actually, it's the 10th of May, 2 years from now. So.
In 15 years? Yeah, I was about to say.
No, not in 15 years. No, I'm 75 now. So I'll be 77 then. I hope to. But I think I'd give you a bit of time. I'm in no hurry. But, you know, it's an enormous field. And I want to be fair to it. I also want to write it in such a way that it interests not only scholars and academics, but also working biographers and working novelists. So somebody asked me the other day, is it a history of biography or is it a how-to book? You know, and I'm saying it's a bit of both. Very difficult to combine. But I, you know, because I teach biography as an art, I want to, you know, hand over a few tips and talk about the various ways in which you can write a biography, the various alternative approaches, and how they've changed over time.
Well, considering you're not going to come out with that for possibly 2 years, can I give you the opportunity to recommend a book of yours based on our conversations that you think I might be particularly interested in? I value your taste, if for no other reason, because of that sweater. That's, for those of my audience who might just be listening, that sweater that's an all-time sweater right there.
Yes, it's known as a Fair Isle sweater.
It's amazing.
It was it was knitted in the Shetland Islands and Western Islands, so you don't get them in England very much now. So we had to order it from Scotland.
I'm gonna have to. What is the name of that? I'm gonna have to. Next time we speak, I'm gonna try to match you.
It's a Fair Isle sweater. I've got a collection of them.
That's amazing.
My wife buys me one every Christmas.
They're very cool.
They come from a shop in Edinburgh.
Okay, so what would you recommend of your work?
Well, I'd like you to read my novel.
And remind me the title of that.
It's called The Quality of the Light.
Quality of the Light. Great title.
And it's set partly in London, partly in Amsterdam. It's called The Quality of the Light, a novel in 5 paintings, because the plot is based on 5 paintings in the National Gallery. And it's partly set in the National Gallery.
Okay, I'm looking up. Can I get this on Amazon?
Oh yeah, just a minute. I can show you a copy. Hold it up to the camera. Can you see that?
Yes, beautiful. Is that one of the paintings?
Yeah.
Very cool. Quality of the Light. Let's see. Novel.
Google it.
I'm looking it up now. Okay. All right.
No, can you find it?
I can't find it on Amazon, but I'm sure I could find it on the web.
I think it's Barnes and Noble, I think sells it.
Okay.
You certainly get it on Amazon.
Okay. I will find it.
Yeah. Okay. I think you should read this one.
I'm looking forward to it. Awesome. Well,
And
thank you
also
again for your,
read Robert Crawford's biography of Eliot too. It's a very fine piece of work.
Eliot has always eluded me. I love The Wasteland,
Yeah.
and I love Parsifal, which of course The Wasteland alludes to, and
Yeah.
I love who the heck Tiresias, of course,
Yeah.
the blind prophet who that The Wasteland
Yeah.
also alludes to. But
Now, this
every
biography takes him right the way through from Missouri, where he was born,
interesting.
to Harvard, across to England, his years in Paris, his disastrous first marriage, the composition of The Wasteland, his conversion to Christianity in 1926, the Four Quartets, which is masterly Christian works that he published in his 50s, the late plays, his very much happier second marriage. It's a fine piece of work.
I'll have to check it out.
Robert
Okay.
Crawford.
Well, I'll be busy.
Okay, yeah, okay. You've got your homework.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I hope to be finished it by the next time we speak, but I hope at any rate that we can speak again. It's always a pleasure.
We will. We'll think of another theme.
Yeah. Wonderful. And you can update us on your work. Well, thank you
Okay.
again. Enjoy. The light was perfect this time.
Was it okay?
Oh, wonderful.
Quality of the light, that's what it's called.
There it is. There it is. All right. Thank you, Professor.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye.
All right. Take care.
Bye.